Everyone Else Saw It by Malcolm MacDonald. My Skype session with my mother was in 5 minutes. I had to admit I missed her. I hadn't been able to visit my tiny hometown in years. In fact, I missed contact with anyone, seeing as my current city had been under lockdown for 14 consecutive months. Fortunately, and unlike many of my friends, I was still earning a salary, though now I had to work remotely from home. It was far from ideal, but being able to work in my pajamas and a cold beer being only 5 paces away from my workstation, lockdown certainly wasn't without its perks. 3 minutes until the Skype meeting. I just wish I hadn't broken up with my girlfriend about a week before the breakout. Or rather, that she hadn't broken up with me. I won't lie. I'd been on thin ice for a while, and the last straw seemed to fall on her birthday. The day I'd promised to take her to see Hamilton in the city, but had been too hungover to go. After 2 days of silence, she phoned and broke off our 11-month courtship. Before hanging up, she whinged about my near nightly binge drinking, how I'd come home late at night, scaring her cats and smelling like a brewery. After the initial heartache had faded, I managed to laugh it off. Same problem I had in my 20s, I thought. Can't blame a guy for wanting to have a good time. Still, being all but confined to the apartment now, it would have been nice to have some company. The walls were so narrow, so confining, and the nights were very, very long. A minute and a half before I had to Skype my mother. Tonight I was already half in the bag, having pounded a few and chased them with vodka. Sure, it was only Wednesday, but as long as my reports met their deadline, no one at the office would complain. I'd been warned once about my tardiness, disheveled dress, and occasional inebriated demeanor during work hours, but now I worked from home, so no one would notice or care. 30 seconds left. Ma had already messaged me twice, asking if I was online. Remembering how, even in a Zoom meeting for work, I could sneak a couple of brews, I skipped over to the kitchenette, pulling a cold one from the fridge and pouring it into a ceramic mug. No reason to think it was anything other than a cup of coffee. It's not like I was hiding anything. I just knew how worried Ma would get, her being a health nut, a neat freak, and devoted follower of the latest health scare making the rounds across the cable news networks. 10:15 p.m. Jonathan, are you ready? I planted myself at the desk, my cold mug of lager in hand, and accepted her request for a Skype call. Within seconds, my mother's pleasant, yet weathered face manifested in the form of a few hundred grainy pixels on my monitor. Since turning 60, she'd stopped getting her hair dyed bronze amber and had let it go gray, which I thought looked much better. I smiled and took a swig of beer. The two of us spoke leisurely for about an hour. At 73, my father, Melvin, had finally decided to retire from the bank. I was glad for that, knowing my father hated that job and never seemed to get the recognition or due compensation he deserved. The bank always making him work extra hours, take on duties above his pay grade, and always making excuses for postponing vacation days or promotions promised months before. I had polished off the contents of the mug within 6 minutes and had started pouring whiskey from a flask off camera to maintain the buzz. My mother never seemed to notice, but then she mentioned something that startled me. "Jonathan, I can't see too well. Who's that in the room with you?" I furrowed my brow, a cold feeling working its way up my spine. I was all alone. There wasn't anyone in the apartment with me. I hadn't had any visitors for weeks. There's no one here except me, Mom." "No, there's someone there. There, standing at the corner to your right." My heart lurched. I spun around, looking to the edge of the hallway leading to my bedroom. There was no one there. Turning slowly, I forced a laugh. "Ma, I think your eyes are playing tricks on you. It's probably the bad quality of the picture you've got. It happens all the time. Computers often mistake certain patterns and objects for human faces." But my mother was adamant. There was someone standing not 8 feet behind me, plain as the nose on her face. Just then I sensed something, like steam, graze the back of my neck. I considered looking back again, but no, it was nothing. Just the power of suggestion. I can't explain exactly where this feeling came from, but the chill up my spine had waxed into a small, glowing fever, and my mother's insistence was really starting to piss me off. "Oh, look, Ma, it's starting to get late, and I have a lot of work to do tomorrow. I'm going to need to go to bed now, so let's just say goodnight." Visibly struck, my mother began to backpedal, asking when we could Skype next, saying that she loved and was proud of me. It was a conscious effort not to roll my eyes. When the session ended, I drained the flask, then drained the mug. My brain was swimming inside my skull, but my stomach was heavy, and my neck was nettled. My mother had spoiled my good mood. It was now 11:15. I decided I'd retire in 45 minutes. Free now to move around unencumbered, I stumbled my way to the fridge and popped another tall boy, taking a deep drink from the can. On the back of the whiskey, the imported lager from Prague tasted of bean juice. I killed it, then popped a second one. Nursing this beer, I walked over to the eastern exposed windows and peered down at the dark street below. I looked down at the local coffee chain, now shuttered, where hours earlier a mob of anti-vaxxers had congregated, protesting the store's policy on masks and the refusal to allow indoor dining. At the time, I had shaken my head, mentally condemning them for their stupidity. Now, alone, staring at the empty sidewalk, I sympathized with them. Maybe illness, or even death, wouldn't be the worst thing to come from all this. I then remembered that I'd read somewhere online that suicide rates had dipped during the pandemic. How could that be? After a year of staying at home, I was climbing up the walls. 40 minutes till midnight. Now, I wasn't drunk. Definitely not. I was tipsy, sure, but not drunk. But I wasn't sleepy either. Feeling restless, I picked up my phone and toyed with the thought of texting my ex. Then, knowing she would accuse me of drunk texting, perhaps looking for a booty call or a quick blowy, I nixed the idea and slammed the phone down on my desk. I didn't need that shit right now. Instead, I remembered my buddy from college, Dorian Wentworth. I knew he was often up late, being on unemployment and collecting checks. The isolation of that night was nibbling at me, and so I texted him, asking for a Zoom meet. Dorian replied immediately in the affirmative. He was already online, playing World of Warcraft, and could use a break. 30 minutes until bedtime. We met on Zoom and shot the shit for a good 15 minutes, talking about everything from our exes to the latest online games to the latest draft decisions of our favorite sports teams. Then, about 17 minutes in, I felt my phone vibrate in my lap. Figuring it was just some junk text, I kept chatting with Dorian. Then I felt another text come through. Not wanting to seem rude, I excused myself and picked up the phone to check. The texts were from Dorian. I looked up at the screen, realizing that Dorian was still talking about nothing. Dorian was blathering on and on as though just trying to force any semblance of a casual, natural conversation. What was he doing that for? When I checked the texts, they read as follows. 11:47 p.m. Dude, who's in that room with you? 11:48. I'm not fucking kidding. Who is that? There's someone right behind you. Feeling that same chill up my back, though the fiery friction of annoyance wasn't far behind, I looked over my shoulder, then did a full sweep of the room. Nothing. There was no one there. Dorian, said I, then shook my head, hearing the drunken slur in my voice. Dorian, You can stop pretending to talk about D&D. I saw your texts. There's no one in the apartment with me. Your computer must have some kind of filter on it. Those things always see faces where there is none. Oh. Okay, said Dorian, fear and trepidation audible in his voice. His bald, cherubic face looked stunned. Okay, no problem. Listen, it's a bit late, so I should be shoving off now. See you later. Before I could say goodbye, Dorian had left the Zoom meeting. Strange, I thought. Almost instantaneously, my phone slithered across the top of the desk, indicating another text message. I picked it up. This time, Dorian had sent a screenshot of the Zoom meeting. The title of the file reading, "Who is that?" I saw my face, my eyes heavy with fatigue and drink, and saw a red circle drawn around a wide space over my shoulder. Again, there was nothing there. Nothing but empty space. The phone then vibrated a final time in my hand. One last text from Dorian. 11:52. Don't you see him? That creepy-looking guy right over your shoulder? I'm telling you, he's right on top of you. Get out of there. I'm going to call the cops. By now I was near livid. My boy Dorian was pestering me with this phantom. What would otherwise just have been an annoyance was amplified into a full-born rage from the booze sloshing around my bloodstream. I texted Dorian back. 11:54 p.m. There's no need to call the cops. There's nothing here. Just fuck off. I sent the message, then turned my phone on silent. 5 minutes left before midnight. Having a hankering for a nightcap, I made the mistake of getting to my feet too fast. I regretted it instantly, finding my legs were sticks of butter beneath me, and the room was spinning before my eyes. It took a good minute for me to find my equilibrium. Then, able to stand firmly on my own 2 feet, I staggered through the hallway to my bedroom and collapsed onto the mattress. I woke 3 hours later. I had to piss something fierce. That wasn't what woke me. I could feel my 40 ABV blood racing through my veins, my heart punching a hole through my chest. My stomach felt like it was filled with rocks, and in my temples I could feel the familiar heat of an onset headache. A hangover for sure. Nothing to get too worried about. When I got out of bed, the crapulent symptoms seemed to recede, and I felt somewhat better. I then strode my way to the commode. Standing, I let out a long stream of urine into the bowl, the dark piss making a small tearing sound against the porcelain. The smell of my piss hit my nostrils, causing my stomach to flip, feeling the familiar rush from my gut to my throat, my gullet filling with saliva. I could no longer kid myself. Kneeling onto the floor, I vomited into the bowl, my puke intermixing with the darkened water. The smell was disgusting, and so I flushed before letting out one more mouthful of regurgitated goo. Panting for a spell, I slowly got to my feet and felt the full force of my self-induced nausea. I thought about the study I'd read a while back, about how the suicide rates had gone down this past year, and then wondered what the rate of liver failure would be. Before returning to bed to nurse my hangover, I splashed some water on my face, then looked into the mirror above the sink. That's when I saw it. The other man. The thing that my mother and Dorian had seen hovering over me. It stood directly behind me as though it were a second head jutting out from my shoulder. I saw its waxy, sallow skin, its dying, bloodshot eyes, the grotesquely bulbous forehead, a swollen, scarlet scab of a nose, and a crooked set of yellow teeth forming a hideous, rictus grin. The face was not just malformed, but disgusting in its humanness. I could not only see it, but feel its hot breath bearing down my neck. It felt like my flesh were ablaze. Adrenaline surging inside me, I dashed out of the apartment, grabbing an overcoat and slippers on the way. Not waiting for the elevator, I ran down the stairwell, 3 steps at a time. Outside the building, but still within the property line of the complex, I fished out a lighter and a cigarette from my coat pocket and lit it up. As I was panting, the tobacco hit my lungs hard, causing me to cough. I took a smaller drag, which soothed the burning at the back of my gullet, and I started to feel better. What was that in the mirror? It was still dark out, dark and empty. I couldn't go far. Not without risking infection, that was. And despite understanding the motives and zest for life demonstrated by the anti-maskers, I wasn't about to tempt catching COVID. Not over some spook in the mirror. Well, I probably wouldn't have caught anything, what with the streets as empty as they were. But why take a risk? I've always been a bit of a hypochondriac. It couldn't have been real, I then thought. That's just stupid. There's no such thing. I then began to chuckle a little, laughing at myself for being so childish. There was nothing there in the mirror, assured that I'd just been dreaming, imagining things from the power of suggestion. I crushed the cig and made my way back inside. By the time I'd slunk back into my room, my temples were in full throb of an agonizing migraine. But at least now my stomach was empty. My blood pressure had gone down to normal. It'd be a rough day, but nothing that I hadn't faced before. I'd get all my work in on time and would even be able to hack it in the staff Zoom meeting without raising any eyebrows. But before I retired to try and salvage what was left of a good night's rest, I crept back to the bathroom. I couldn't say why, other than that there was some invisible force pulling me back in front of that mirror. Perhaps I just needed to assure myself one last time it was all in my head. But when I stood there, facing my reflection, it only took a minute before the specter reappeared. There was no surprise or shock this time, not like a jump scare in the movies. Instead, the apparition just materialized into view, as though re-emerging from beneath a black pool of liquid. Its crooked, hideous grin seemed to taunt me from the other side of the glass. I had a good look at it and realized I'd seen it before. I'd seen the same face in my dreams, in my nightmares, and the reflections and shadows that always seemed to follow me ever since I was 6 years old. The specter had always been there, always following me, but was now far more palpable, far more powerful. I knew the specter would always be with me, always shadowing. But in all my terror-filled childhood dreams, I'd never seen the specter hovering this close behind. And I'd never seen its face look so near to my own reflection in the mirror. What happened next? The accumulation of events defied reason and sanity. It took a moment, but soon I realized I couldn't breathe. Or at least, it seemed like I couldn't breathe. The air was so dense, so thick, humid and hot, like jungle mist. It smelled of acetone and stale yeast and reeked of bile. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end and burned like candles at a midnight vigil. That was where it was the hottest. The back of my neck, where the enormous mouth of the specter was closest. My chest heaving, my own breathing now audible. I tried to tear myself from the mirror, to even turn around to face my tormentor, but I was stuck there by the same force that had drawn me in to take a second glance. I might have extricated myself earlier, before the face had reappeared, but now it was too late. The heat cindering my flesh grew brighter, taking on a wet, moist quality somehow, and the sounds of the heavy breathing, mine or the specter's I couldn't be sure, was bludgeoning my ears. It was maddening in its monotony and incessance. The room was a furnace, and still that face, that horrible yellow face, was staring. glaring at me from the mirror. I turned the taps, then promptly twisted them back, finding only white fog billowing from the pipes. I was so hot and so thirsty. What the hell was happening? Why was it happening? I wasn't sure how I know, but that face in the mirror was the cause of it all. I just knew it. Acting on inertia, I slapped the glass, aiming for the specter's reflection. The mirror's surface was chilled, almost cold. It might have only been that it was slick, but to my touch, it felt like ice inside of that boiling room, like cool, refreshing water. It then came to me. Of course. It made perfect sense. It was the only thing left to do. I struck at the mirror again, this time with a closed fist. The glass wobbled on its hooks, the specter's image in mine disappearing for a fleeting second in shimmering waves. Just a little more. It's almost over. I threw a right hook into the glass, putting my hip into the throw, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The silvery shards lay inside the basin before me, glinting in the moonlight like a billion lost stars. Feeling something wet on my knuckles, I brought my hand to my nose and smelled blood. The wheezing cacophony had ceased, but the room was still unbearable, growing hotter by the second, and my feet were still glued to the floor. At least I didn't see that face. Then, looking down at the shards of glass winking at me from the sink, I got a second idea. Another brilliant plan by anyone's standard of drunken dream logic. But then, anybody sober and rational hearing it might well say it was the only course of action I had left to free myself of the looming figure. The best thing for me at this point. I reached down and picked up a shard of the former mirror, a particularly long blade-shaped piece. It felt so cool, so soothing in my hand. It's just like shaving, I thought, speaking to myself. It's just like a shave after a long, hot shower. Maroon oozing from my knuckles, the sweat on my back evaporating instantly in the boiling hell room. I stretched my neck, pointing my chin upward, and drew the makeshift razor close. It feels so smooth, I thought, feeling a jagged edge graze my 3-day stubble. It's just like shaving. The warbling birds outside roused me. In the weak daylight, I found myself face down on the floor, blood everywhere. Am I dead? I thought. No, but close to it. I looked around me, discovering the scarlet splatter I was lying on. That and the shards of the broken mirror. My head felt like an expanding water balloon about to burst. But that wasn't what concerned me. I felt a sting, most prominent in the side of my neck. I then remembered what I'd done, or what I'd almost done, before blacking out, and felt a thrill of panic rise inside my chest. Did I? Fearing the worst, I grabbed a large piece of mirror, one not too obscured by venezious smudges, and looked at myself. Past the blood caked to my skin, I could make out a long, fleshy scar, carving its way from my sternomastoid up over my jaw, and ending in a hook along my cheek, just shy of meeting the corner of my mouth. A scratch, a bad one, but nothing fatal. That being said, I'd lost a lot of blood. I'd have to call a doctor. Probably go to the hospital. Easing myself vertical, almost falling over from blood loss, I grabbed a towel and pressed it to my lacerated face and neck. I then walked my way to the kitchen, pouring a tall glass of orange juice, then dialed 911. I was discharged from the hospital hours later. The facility was hopelessly overburdened with patients, but they managed to stitch me up and send me on my way, telling me to pick up a roll of gauze and some antibiotic ointment from the pharmacy before I left. As much as I was worried about catching COVID, I was kind of relieved that the hospital had so much else on their plate to deal with. No nagging questions about whether this was a suicide attempt or how much alcohol or drugs I'd consumed. I didn't need that shit right now. Though one of the nurses did find time to comment that my scar looked like a question mark, with a hooked end and all. I didn't know what to make of that. By the time I arrived home, it was past noon, and I'd missed the Zoom meeting for work. I texted my supervisor with a half-baked excuse, lying about what happened but keeping in the part about going to the hospital. Hopefully it would fly. I hadn't taken any days off from work in months. Still, they probably knew. Beside the wound in the shattered mirror, there was no evidence of the incident last night. There was no boiling heat, no bodiless face hovering over me. Even my clothes weren't sweat through like they ought to have been. It was nothing but an idiotic nightmare, fueled by too much beer and too much spirit. Sitting at my desk, feeling faint but mostly present, I thought about whiling away some hours online, playing Minecraft or scrolling through Facebook. But before any of that, I thought, first things first. I scoured the fridge, then my desk and all of the cupboards for liquor, finding beer, wine, and spirit. Then, without hesitation, poured the contents of each can, bottle, and Mickey down the kitchenette sink. It was somehow satisfying, watching the brownish-yellow liquid disappear into the drain. I found further satisfaction crushing each aluminum can before stuffing them with the glass into a black trash bag. I lugged the bag down the steps, not bothering with the elevator, and deposited the heavy load on the street. Back in my apartment, I felt contented, and for the first time in months, years perhaps, clean, pure, I decided, despite my misadventure, to attempt some of the reports. Maybe if I sent them in before midnight, it would make up for missing the Zoom call with my coworkers. Maybe they'd notice with time how I'd turned a new leaf, how I'd become a new man. Yes, this felt good. This felt right, but it only took a few hours until I realized the farce I was playing, until I felt that feeling, that pull, the same gravitational force that had drawn me to the mirror a second time the night before. Getting up from my chair, I inched my way into the bedroom, where a full-length mirror was waiting for me. I began to feel thirsty. Who was I kidding? Standing in front of the mirror, staring at it, I waited, seeing nothing but my own reflection, the gauze on my bandage starting to look soiled. Then, as though on cue, it appeared. The grinning yellow face. This time, it didn't look like it was right behind me, but instead beside me, as though the floating bodiless head was resting its chin on my shoulder, the two of us standing cheek to cheek like lovers. There was no heavy breathing this time, no suffocating heat in the room, but something about the specter's appearance had changed. Wanting a better look, I turned my head to the side, and the specter mimicked me in sync, exposing that side of its face, as it almost eclipsed mine. There, marking the specter's waxy flesh, was a deep, black gash, the wound starting up from the side of its neck and ending in a hook along its bloated, yellow cheek.